So we've got a great group with us today. The thing we're going to be talking about is creative classrooms in 2020 and beyond. We had a 1-hour discussion yesterday, which was the first half of this panel, wherein a bunch of us got together and really thought about what are we doing right now in terms of creative classrooms that we'd like to see disseminated and given more attention and further researched. And the theme for today, which is the second half of the panel, is really what do we want to see in the future? And the future can be as close as next week, or it can be as distant as 20 years from now. But I'd like to stay somewhere within that scope. Let's not talk about 100 years from now. Let's stay within our own lifetimes and just think about like what would we like to see ourselves achieve, and what would we like other people in our field to achieve in terms of nurturing and supporting creativity and creative classrooms. And so I'm going to start with Mr. Monty Jones, who is always a good person to start with. Let's turn to Monty.
Thanks, Daniel. So sort of continuing a little bit on from yesterday, I'll start with some of the background of what I'm doing. Most of my work in this area has been involved with pre-service and in-service teacher learning. And in particular, we've been working with tools and technologies from the maker movement. And so as we talked about yesterday, I think one of the things that we look for in the future is sort of the alignment between content standards and how we're aligning that with creativity. So for example, one of the issues we've come up with in a lot of the training that we've done is sort of a misalignment between some of the proposed benefits of maker-centered learning with content standards. So for example, a lot of people suggest that maker-centered learning has the ability to increase failure positivity, student agency, and these I guess broader but positive dispositions. And at the same time, teachers are required to address state standards. And so I think one of the things that's going to be interesting in the future is seeing how we can align these content standards along with these other dispositions. And I would include elements of creativity in that, right? Like it's one of those things we only, we value what we judge, right? And if we're not looking to sort of assess creativity, I think often it can fall to the side, unlike content standards. So I think that's going to be one of the big, and I'd love to hear anyone else's opinion on that, but I think that's going to be one of the big hurdles moving forward.
Reminds me a little bit of when we kindergarten teachers had to justify play in the classroom, and they would do alignment of each type of like the social play center would be aligned with the standards. And that's one of my hopes, that technology will push us back to play more and this alignment.
So that's such an interesting point, right? Because even the idea of play in itself, though, was not valued, correct? You were sort of forced to say it had to align with these other things. Is that?
Yes, and as the high stakes assessment became privileged, then you would see classrooms push down content into lower grades. And so sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between a kindergarten classroom from a third grade classroom. And all kinds of elements of play were replaced with tables and chairs and paper and pencil, different things like that.
And is that something that you've seen any movement in, or is it the same now as it was before?
I haven't seen any movement except in independent schools.
Right.
The influence of Reggio Emilia, which also has influence on Maker. So people who, and I find it fascinating because the educators in Reggio Emilia look at the theory that we're developed and identified here in the US, like Dewey and Bruner, and then they implement it, but we ignore it.
David Slykeis is in the house, and I believe he's the other one who's officially on the panel. So David, could you just give us your thoughts?
Even turn on my video to give you my thoughts, so you can really see those thoughts spewing out of my head. So a few thoughts to build a little bit on what Monty was talking about with maker movements and so forth. Glenn Bull and I from UVA have been working on maker curriculum and computational thinking and all this kind of stuff for a long time. And what Monty mentioned has been a real roadblock of ours, is that we think that of course we think this, but we think we've come up with this really cool curriculum and ideas and how this can all be used and all this. And we have the hardest time getting it into schools because of content, basically content standards. And teachers are like, well, that's really cool, but what content am I meeting with that? And, what can I do? For that concept, I have, 3 days in my scope and sequence. I can't do this whole maker project that would take a week and so forth. And so, that's been a continual frustration for us. So I think that if I'm looking to the future and what could creative classrooms look like, what I would really like to see, hopefully, and maybe some good will come out of this whole COVID crisis, some relaxing of some of those standards on content and so forth. And when they find out that testing doesn't happen this spring and that the world doesn't fall apart and crumble, that perhaps, that we can be more creative and what we allow students to do can change and that will really have some effect. The other, to go in a different direction, my other hat now, I've moved over full time to the dark side of administration. And when I'm thinking about creativity, one of the things that really bothers me a lot, especially in this role, is if faculty and so forth have a great idea, even at the university level, like, oh, I want to do this cool idea or run this and so forth, and it doesn't fit in the box, that is even higher ed. K-12 has a lot of boxes that things have to fit into, but the same thing with higher ed. Oh, it's going to fall outside of our semester dates, so we can't offer that, or it doesn't run the right number of hours and all of this kind of stuff. And it just really frustrates me with all of the red tape and so forth that can hold up the really creative ideas. And by the time those really creative ideas fit all of the parameters, they've lost so much of the creativity. So, I'm hoping that there's a way in the future that we can really allow for some of this, so some of these ideas to come to fruition more rapidly and in a sense that they're in the way that they are really meant to be, instead of always having to fit in a box. So there you go. There's my 2 cents.
Yeah, great points. Is there anyone that wants to just build directly on that? So I feel like my professor hat is kicking in, and I'm going to turn to Natalie Millman, who I've seen at lots of conferences and whose name sounds just like mine, Tillman. So Natalie, are you listening in? And could you just tell us what you're thinking about creative classrooms in the future? No, Natalie. What about Christy Wright? Christy Wright, could you just tell us what are you planning on doing in the future in terms of creative classrooms, and what would you like to see people looking at?
Sure. Yeah, I think that all of this COVID stuff is really going to change, or at least challenge, what we have been doing, and hopefully push higher ed in a different direction, because I think what we're doing right now oftentimes becomes somewhat irrelevant. And I know I've been struggling with this even the last few weeks. I'm teaching online, and I was always supposed to be teaching online, so that's normal. But I'm teaching graduate teacher education classes, and I'm just so sick of the discussion board, the traditional discussion board. And it's driving me crazy. So I've been implementing different things like using VoiceThread instead, or collaborating on a Google Doc and then bringing that into VoiceThread to then further the conversation later on in the week. But I don't feel like it's transformative enough yet. And so, I've tried Flipgrid, and I've had students embed videos or sketch notes or different things like that. And I think that the teachers sometimes become overwhelmed because they're like, and this isn't an ed tech master's degree program, which I typically would have taught it in the past. And they're like, all this technology, it's so overwhelming. I can't handle it right now with all the technology that we have to deal with teaching our students online now. And I'm like, hey, you need to get on board. So.
Yeah, some great points. And I particularly echo the sentiment that I feel like so many of the tools that people tell me are revolutionary are just a different skin on the discussion board. Like, instead of a discussion board with text, it's a discussion board where every kid uploads a video of themselves. I'm like I'm gonna sit through 200 of these 1-minute videos of people repeating their definition of, and so, and then, the discussion board becomes the blog with the mandated, one of our speakers earlier was talking about how, play becomes mandated, and here's the worksheet on how you're supposed to have fun. Do 1, then 2, then 3. And, play becomes very prescribed. And we take these discussion boards and we convert them into videos and blogs with feedback, but it's still the same teacher-led discussion about a mandated topic that everyone has to pretend they're interested in and drink the Kool-Aid. So does anyone have any ideas for stuff that we could do online or live, assuming we ever do again have live classes, that they would like to try out in the future? I'm personally very excited about augmented reality. I think it's going to do a lot of things that virtual reality promised but never delivered. I think virtual reality is a very solipsistic experience. You're alone, and you're everything's digitally mediated. I think augmented reality is a much more social experience, much more appropriate for the classroom, much more teacher friendly. But of course, the $3,000 headset isn't yet, quite viable. So, so I'm very interested in that. I'm very interested in Maker. We just spent about 2 years having kids make guitars, electric guitars, little 3rd graders building electric guitars, and all we provide is a pickup and some directions. We're thinking of switching to boats, hoping to get some funding from the Department of the Navy. But all of that is hypothetical at this point. My university is currently debating whether we're going to have classes in the fall or mandate that they all be online in the fall. So we're already fully online for the summer. We're discussing at what point do we decide that we're going to be fully online for the fall, since we don't know, So with that said, let's turn to my good friend Jason Trumbull. Jason, what are you up to these days, and what are you planning on doing in the future?
Yeah, I love that you mentioned augmented reality, because I think that there are already some really cool tools that we have. And I teach undergrad and graduate teacher education and teacher development, I guess, courses, digital age teaching and learning, kind of being able to analyze our students and see who they are now and how they're a little bit different than they were, 30 years ago when some of us started teaching, not me. But I think one of the things that I love is being able to see my students create and put their creations into augmented reality. And it can be as simple as their own small drawing, and they're using the iPad through an augmented reality, and they love it, and they see the usefulness of that in their classroom. So I appreciate that crossover. But Daniel, the thing I was going to ask you was, going back to your graduate work and going back to your undergrad, what classes did you have, and what things did your instructors do that had the biggest impact on you? And the reason I ask that is because we talk a lot about the impact we have on our students. And I remember there was a professor that I had at Baylor in my PhD program. Her class, at that time, I was like, man, this isn't, she's not really doing anything. What we would do is we would read books and read articles, and then we would talk about them. But I remember more from that class and what seems like loosey-goosey nature of it than any of my lecture courses because I had to be invested and I had to be present. So, and there was more to it than just reading and talking. But I think that I wonder, kind of what your thought is on where did you find your creativity in your experience?
I'll just give a quick answer to that, but it's definitely not the one most people would have. I was a very poor student in the K-12 system, doing the minimal necessary. Same through most formal ed. It was really only military training that really resonated with me. I really liked boot camp at Parris Island. I really liked MCT. I really liked combat engineer school. I thought combat engineer, that's kind of like being an engineer, but for me, that the hands-on of doing something that was high risk, like you face the claymore the wrong way, you're dead. It's like there's zero room for error. So that the high risk plus everything was 100% hands-on. They had no respect for book learning. I used to get in trouble if they ever saw me reading a book. They're like, "Oh, you got time to read a book, huh?" And so for me, it's always been about not how do we instill the discipline and the violence and any of that stuff, but just like high contact, high risk, but in a safe environment. So that's definitely, I'm sure everyone else has very different answers. Who has a more scalable answer?
I love that. Yesterday, we talked about risk and we talked about how taking risks can lead to success, but sometimes we fail and we don't have the persistence to get through that failure.
Yeah.
So Daniel, it's kind of the same. It's kind of completely different. But when I put the groups of teachers into the makerspace, in the interviews, they expressed often, they were like, look, we were scared. All right, we could cut a finger off, and luckily they did not. But they were like this, and they even said it. They were like, the risks of what we're doing right here is not like failing a test.
Yeah.
They're like, we can get hurt. And what that prompted them, that actually put them back in this mind space of being a student in a very, very real way, right? So teachers go to PD and they said, oh, it's mostly stuff we already know with small twists on it. But they're like, you stick us in there and we're pouring, molten aluminum and we're using these buzz saws. There is very real risk. And we got scared and we were scared to ask questions. And they said that actually reminds us. And they said that they viewed their students differently now, because they would say, a lot of times the students are like, I don't know what to ask. And they would say, well, you're just being lazy. And they said, no, there was times we were just scared. We didn't know what to ask. And so there was, and I'm not saying this is good practice to put kids in things that can get hurt, but it was an interesting thing that kept coming out in these interviews, that it made it very real and it made them sort of reconsider what it was like to be a learner again.
Yeah, that's just absolutely what we found in my lab. And so what we're trying to do is how do we scare students the way you're describing, in a way that's pedagogically engaging, but not put them in danger. I have zero interest in real danger with students because it's just too hard with the IRB and the insurance, like nothing with fire, nothing with...
Well, I'm not sure scaring them. Maybe that word...
Well, no, but so let me give you an example of how we are scaring teachers in a positive way. So teachers very often struggle with students who don't get base 10. Like the decimal base 10 is super hard for them. So what we do with our pre-service math teachers is we make them solve problems in base 8 or base 6 or base 12. And they confront a problem in that situation and suddenly they feel like an idiot. They're like, I can't even add 12 plus 3 in base 7 without like losing my mind and be totally unsure of myself. And so now I know what it's like to first encounter base 10 and decimal. And so how do we scare them? So we definitely need a better word when we publish than scare, but how do we engage students and teachers in a way that's outside of their comfort zone, but certainly within our safety zone? And so I'm definitely not advocating, I see in the comments, swapping books for claymores. I would say swapping claymores for books, but how do we make books as engaging as claymores is definitely a really interesting question. That's why I'm so interested in boats right now. Boats are incredibly dangerous. This poor woman just recently drowned with her son, a Kennedy. There's no amount of money who can save you if you're on a boat and something goes wrong. Watch the Robert Redford movie sometime. It's just amazing how people treat these things trivially because they consider them fun. And so how do we approach something like boats in a safe way, where it's like a model boat in a tub, but if it drowns, no one dies, but like everyone on your boat drowned. Sorry, your design wasn't good enough. With the guitars, we didn't have much at risk so much as pride versus shame. Like, does your guitar play? Okay, well, it plays, but does it look cool or does it look like a shoebox, right? And so we want to have activities, you know, to my mind, what I would like to see in the future is activities where the kids who put in the effort and the thought, not the money or the resources, but the effort and the thought, build something amazing and impressive and have an incredibly positive experience. And they don't even care what grade they get, because now they know, you know, I want to be a boat designer. I want to be a guitar maker. I know what I want to be. And now I'll go get the degrees and the grades because that's what you got to do in this world. But I'd much rather see a kid inspired to have a purpose than a kid who's like, oh, now I know how to get an A in this class. And I'll just say as a final thought on grading, what I find works for me the best in terms of putting the least amount of effort as possible on grading is having students do self-assessment, whether it's a kindergarten or a graduate student. At the midpoint of the class, at the end point of the class, one of the questions is, what grade do you think you've earned? Tell me why. And if I agree with you, we don't have to talk about it. And guess what? My work's done for 99 out of 100 students. You know, and the ones that I do have to talk to, it's usually because they're so hard on themselves. I got to tell them, you know, you really did earn an A. You don't have to be so hard on yourself, you know, or a B or whatever it was. So who wants to build on that? Anyone want to continue our discussion from there?
You know, I might be going off in a different direction than you expect, and this might date me a bit. But as you're talking about this, I have this image in my head of The Breakfast Club, and the character of what was his name? Anthony Michael Hall's character, who is in detention because he's an A+ student, except for he's failing shop because he can't get his elephant thing to work. But you look at how terrible it was for him, but how transformative it was for his character in the long run. Exactly. To move away from grades being the sole valuation in a class. You know, that he has to struggle with that, and how powerful it was, especially when he's talking to these other guys who look at him like, yeah, you're an idiot for failing shop, but you know, but that doesn't define who you are. Yeah. And I wonder how much of that we've stripped away because we don't know how to we've clung to these quantifications of what learning looks like because that's how we can determine funding. And it gets into this big thing, but this idea that the only way we can quantify education is through assessment and scores, and because then that's how we determine funding. It strips away ideas of creativity, and it strips away independence for the teacher who recognizes what that one student in their class needs that could transform that student.
Yeah, definitely. And to speak to what you're speaking to, and to what Jana Willis is speaking to in the comments, Jana says, how do we think students are going to adjust to no grades, only pass fail? I think that I think there aren't any grades in real life, but overachievers are very focused in real life, and that's because because every discipline has its own metrics, and no discipline respects any other discipline's metrics. And so, if you're an athlete, an Olympic medal means a lot. If you're a scholar, an Olympic medal means you just wasted 4 years getting an Olympic medal, you know, when you could have been publishing, you know. And so, so you find a discipline that works for you. And I think there's some disciplines that really care about grades. And then there are other disciplines like rock and roll that don't care at all about grades. In fact, they're anti-grades. And so I think overachievers are people who achieve something in a field. And I think that field has its own criteria. And so I'm not too worried about the overachievers. It's the underachievers I'm worried about. I think without grades, they're going to flounder unless there's some other metric. And so for me, the only way that make and creativity and digital fabrication and all these constructivist paradigms work in schools is if they're producing something that they're proud of and they care about and that they want to show people after the class is done, and that's more important than the grade they get. And then if they become invested in that discipline, then there are people in that discipline that can guide them to understanding, you know, what is great art, what is great music, what is great food. But you can't just say I'm a great chef. Like, other people have to confer that upon you. Just like you can't just say I'm a great airline pilot. Other people confer that upon you by trusting you with their lives, you know? And so I think we need to come up with activities in the classroom that are aligned enough with learning that they qualify as education, but really what we're driving for is not something you can grade, but something where what they produce is of value to them and therefore fits within some discipline that has metrics for evaluation. So for me, it's been about dance and music for the last 5 years, all music, some dance, a lot of choreography, but all, how do we take math and dance and put them together? How do we take science and music and put them together? It's just super hard to find funding. Dr. Bull was telling me he's good at finding funding at anything, but I'm not as good at him. And so I'm switching to boats because of that thing Monty was mentioning. I think danger, I think a scary thing, like if you don't build this boat right, it sinks. If you don't build a guitar right, it's just out of tune. Like the stakes are so much higher. So that's what I'm focusing on. I really want to get some funding. It's so hard to motivate students without funding. There's a couple of studies where they look at money and just paying students to get better grades. If that's what you care about, better grades, just literally the most effective thing is give them money. As a parent or a teacher, just $1 for an A to a kindergartner. That's like his whole life, you know. David.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be really interesting, and I think that this spring is going to be a ginormous social experiment on grading as so many universities are moving to pass fail and so forth. And you know, I know that our university sort of drug their feet at making that decision, because one of the things that we are really worried about is, oh no, what if our students go to apply for grad school or, you know, to med schools or all of this, and they have all of these pass fails on their transcript. They're never going to get allowed in and so forth. But I mean, it's not going to be our students. It's going to be every student that has that from this semester. And so I mean, higher ed and, all of those other post-secondary experiences, farther on in graduate school or, doc schools and all of that, they're all going to have to consider, well, if everyone's grades look the same, if everyone has passes, how are we going to distinguish between students, and who do we want and who do we not want? And so hopefully this will actually force a little creativity into the whole process of figuring out that, maybe there are some other things that we can look at besides just grades.
Yeah, absolutely. As some examples, MIT will allow you to now submit a portfolio for their engineering undergraduate program if you feel the SATs and your grades don't represent you. And so I think any system where it's an alternative to grades instead of replacing grades will get less resistance. But there are fields where grades are truly irrelevant, like music for the most part, unless you're a scholar of music. And so I think we can look at the fields that are taken seriously, that have centuries of figuring out pedagogy that has nothing to do with grades. The idea that you would give a musician an A or B or C is such a recent idea. In the medieval era, they were training amazing musicians for hundreds of years. It had nothing to do with A's, B's, and C's. They had many other mechanisms, both carrots and sticks. But I think that no mechanism replaces self-motivation. And the only self-motivation I know for anything is to be genuinely interested. And so as long as the stuff we have to teach in school isn't really relevant to the 21st century, it's hard for me to lie to the kids and tell them this does matter when it really doesn't, And so I do a lot of design activities, and I try to get kids to think like designers. And I figure whatever you're going to be in life, it's good to bring a design mentality to it, which just means defining the criteria for success. Like, what's a successful author? Well,
Yeah.
that's very subjective if you're an author, if you're an artist. But if you're a designer, you say it means 3 publications a year in these journals, or it means 1 autobiography every, you define it. And that's what designers, to my mind, do in terms of separating themselves from artists. They're not motivated by the glory of the object. Go ahead, David. I can see.
Yeah, I was just gonna bring home a case study to your example about music. My oldest daughter is graduating from LSU this spring with music education. She plays trumpet, and she was looking at grad schools to go on for trumpet performance. And as she was applying, all of the grad schools for trumpet performance didn't even ask what her grades were. And it was the only sole criteria was she had to send in a recording, and if they liked her recording, she had to go play for them live, and that was it. And she's one of those people that had really great grades, and she was really irritated that they didn't count for anything once she went there. Fortunately, she also plays the trumpet well, so it all turned out okay. But I mean, it was exactly what you're talking about. They could not care less what her grades were to get into a trumpet performance master's program.
Yeah.
Hey, and I think Cecil Short has some good comments here. I don't know if he wants to jump in, but it is interesting, right? Like when we talk about music, so I was also a first-year music student. We absolutely had grades, and so yeah, I don't know if Cecil wants to jump in or not, but
oh, I can, I guess, as soon as my green screen loads. There we go. So I was president of a music fraternity. The number one reason people in my fraternity didn't graduate, grades. I can't pass piano proficiency. I can't get higher than a C in piano proficiency. It's like, dude, it's your 5th semester of piano proficiency. You can't get higher than a C. He is now teaching high school band somewhere. He finally got out. My brother has a master's degree in tuba performance. Want to know what the hardest thing was for him? Grades. Like, it's this idea, like, we still put value on something. We still want to evaluate people somehow. I would even maybe guess that David's daughter, when she sent in that recording, they had some kind of rubric that they used to determine what makes this recording better than the other recordings, right? Like, there's still some kind of evaluation given to it. And so even though we're saying, like, well, we don't need grades, we're just supplanting the idea of a letter grade with some kind of other evaluation.
Yeah, definitely. That's a very good point. Yeah, I'm not saying by any stretch get rid of evaluation. I'm saying if you're going to evaluate someone on how good they are at playing golf, have them play golf. Don't have them take a multiple choice test on golf. And so what I would imagine is your friends getting credentials in music had no problems with the music. They had problems with the test about the music. And so I would just say that's not that's a problem with the music program. If their goal is to produce great musicians, but if their goal is to produce music scholars or music historians, then absolutely, it's a very different criteria. But no, my main idea is not at all to get rid of evaluation. It's to have students make something where someone who knows something about that thing can evaluate it and tell whether it's high quality or not. Like Monty could look at one of the little guitars, which is very much like a ukulele. They usually have 2 to 4 strings. They're not, very bassy. And he could tell you without even meeting the kids, which 2 or 3 kids really took the last semester seriously, which 10 kids did what they could, and which 3 kids didn't do anything at all. And so the evaluation of the objects, supplanting the evaluation of the kid through an inauthentic measure like a multiple choice test or an essay, when what they're supposed to be learning is how to play the tuba. In theory, if your friend was the best tuba player, a good music program would have nurtured that, And so when I talked briefly about military training before, the thing I loved about military training is it's purely criterion based. The best rifleman is the guy who can hit the target the most times under the worst conditions. There's no test. There's no who they like. It's purely who can march the furthest with the most weight, And so any field that has real criteria for evaluation, to me, is super interesting and a great place to think about where education can become authentic. So I think we're in agreement.
So it sounds like there's an idea, like, it's not so much that we need to change the way in which we're assessing, we need to change what we're assessing.
Exactly.
It's like we need to move away from this paper pencil. Can you guess what the right answer is on a test? To can you actually show me? And I think that performance based, that mastery based grading is obviously very valuable. But even with that, we still have some way of being able to differentiate. You know, what makes someone the best tuba player? Well, we have to have some way to differentiate him from other tuba players. So.
Definitely. And so this was one of the more interesting things Glenn Bull said yesterday. Glenn Bull was the professor to many of us here, myself, Monty, David in some ways. And Glenn Bull said, I've been at this 30 years, and bring in any content expert and they can connect their content with anything. If I'm an expert at guitar, I can tell you the math, I can tell you the science, I can tell you, but the problem is not every guitar teacher is a teacher. And every teacher is not a guitar expert. And so how do we scale that with a normal 5th grade teacher? We can always go into the school and find the one teacher who already knows about guitars, or the teacher who tries everything, is already in charge of gifted and talented. But for this to scale, we can't show up with this kind of expertise. And the connections between areas of expertise in math and science are obvious to the expert, but completely, like, you know, I say to someone like Monty, where's the math in the ukulele? He could talk for 4 hours. I say to a math teacher, where's the math in the ukulele? And they're like, what does that have to do with algebra? You know, and so that disconnect between what the expertise know is that their field connects with everything, and what the teachers know is like, I gotta focus on this content, I don't see the connection. So Monty, could you just talk a little bit more about what Glenn was saying yesterday on that? Because I think it answered your question.
Yeah, but actually, Melissa, you were going to jump in a second ago.
Oh, sure.
I was. It's not as relevant anymore. Do you want me to jump in anyway?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So, and I was just thinking with this grading and evaluation conversation, because I'm at Arizona State University. I work with Punya Mishra here, and I spent a semester in an architecture studio, just watching how they learn and what they do. I have hours and hours of videos of this architecture studio. And one thing that came out of that for me a lot is I was trying to understand design and how they design and how they taught design. And this making of representations of something and using that as an assessment method, but it wasn't just to evaluate who's best or who's proficient. They would ask students, you know, if you make something, keep it out, don't throw it away, take pictures of every step along the way, because then the professor can come in and see and understand the student better by looking at what they've made. And so in addition to just, you know, oh, this performance tells us whether they're proficient or not, the thing about this authentic product as something to evaluate is it also gives you insight into what they actually might be thinking and missing and doing, versus a multiple choice test, which doesn't really give you insight into, at least in certain content areas, it doesn't give you insight into how they're actually thinking, what they're actually missing about it. And so I just wanted to add that, like, when we think of grades and stuff, it's more than just the content judging who's proficient, who's better, whatever, who should pass. It's also understanding what they know and trying to get insight on that in order to help them.
It's funny. Those are you made a bunch of really good points there. I mean, one, just the idea of artifact as representing something, right? But yeah, it's funny. This kind of goes back to I taught a class on arts integration, and one of the things I thought was so interesting was using arts-based assessments, and not to repeat exactly what you just said, but that you get a much deeper understanding of someone's knowledge when they create this artifact to represent, much more than you would get from any sort of fill in the blank test or any just sort of question answer, anything. But I think what's difficult then is, and I'm teaching this class to pre-service teachers, you know, their obvious questions are, at the end of the day, and I don't want to keep going back to this, but they're, you know, at the end of the day, they are held accountable to fill in the blank bubble test. And so if they don't prepare their students for that, they may be dinged on it. Is just one of their concerns. But yeah, it was just considering arts-based assessment, I thought was so interesting. Just the fact that you get a much richer understanding of what they get out of this thing. I thought it was cool.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that not that teachers are in a really hard place, because you're right. Like, I'm working with some teachers right now, and actually it's great now they don't have standardized testing, so they can try out new things and not feel that pressure, which is really nice. But normally, they really do have stuff they have to accomplish and do. But at the other end, it's important for us to remember that this is a system that has been designed across time. It's not an absolute. So although it is very difficult, and I don't expect we're going to change and get rid of grades and everything, I think it's important to remember that it's not like a given thing. Like, we can explore different ways and maybe push the boundaries in some places instead of assuming that this is how it always has to be. Again, it's very hard to do, and I'm not expecting we're going to turn over everything all at once, but it helps for me to think that way, because it kind of expands what I can do a little bit.
Yeah, and to give a concrete example of that, I'm not sure how many of you are in states that have transitioned from your teacher preparation exam being a multiple choice test, like ours was currently, to the new system we're using, which is called EdTPA. Anyone in an EdTPA state? Wonderful. Well, with EdTPA, the teachers no longer do a multiple choice content exam. They now create a digital portfolio of over a year of teaching and grading and student feedback and videos. It's extremely time intensive, very comprehensive. In 2015, all Texas teachers will be required to be EdTPA certified instead of multiple choice test. And where goes Texas, so goes the nation. They say California is already on board. So once California and Texas agree on something, it's pretty much done. And the great news about this is that it's no longer a multiple choice test, which means that when teachers go into schools, they're no longer thinking in terms of multiple choice tests. They're thinking in terms of a digital portfolio. I think how we assess our future teachers is going to be the model that they carry over. And if they're no longer determined based on this test, I think it's going to have a ripple effect all the way through K-12. That's my hope. And that they'll all be open to this idea of a digital portfolio, because that's what they did. So I think this could have a huge impact. Anyone else want to talk about how EdTPA is impacting their state? Christy, I saw that you're in an EdTPA state. What's going on with you guys?
Wisconsin. So we're not just doing EdTPA, we're doing both.
Oh, okay.
So they still have to take the Praxis 2 multiple choice test, and they still have to take the Foundations of Reading test, which is really a tough test on literacy that elementary ed teachers have to take, like reading specialists and those two. So I like EdTPA. I think the process is really good and it's highly reflective. But when we're coupling it with the Praxis 2 and the standardized test still, it's one more thing.
Yes, exactly. That's been the reaction of our faculty, which is like, well, it might be better, but it's one more thing we have to deal with. And so
if we could get rid of the others, that would be good.
Yeah, we're doing the same as you. We've got a 3-year period where you have either option. You can be an early adopter for EdTPA, or like the countdown is starting for the last time you can take the.
They're fully implemented, but they still have to do both.
They have to pass both? They can't just pass one or the other. You can pass one or the other.
No, they have to do all of them.
Well, that's the worst idea possible. Congratulations.
So they can take tests and perform.
Yeah, I mean, they understand the EdTPA is like literally thousands of hours of work. Like, it's not like a trivial thing. It's like doing a master's thesis. But, well, I don't think you're going to have, I think a lot of teachers are going to look at the neighboring states for better options. I know I would. I know in Texas, our biggest problem is that we're right next to New Mexico. And New Mexico is like, oh, you have an undergraduate degree, you can be a teacher. And so a lot of our students figure out what the requirements are in El Paso. It'll take them 2 years. They go to New Mexico, and it's like, oh yeah, do like a summer program and write an essay and we'll make you a teacher. And so, so states can't really treat it like it's a closed system anymore. So, so who else is in a system where they are doing anything interesting or want to talk about anything? Anyone we haven't heard from yet? Is Kevin there? Or maybe Julie? Are these people who just log in and stay logged in for the whole day, I'm guessing? Yeah. All right. Well, is anyone who hasn't spoken actually there?
Hey, Daniel, I sent you some information. This is Kevin.
Kevin, excellent. Tell us what you're up to.
I just had sent you some information. I just piggybacked off of, or was connecting to what you were talking about. First of all, I think it's interesting you're building boats in El Paso.
I know.
I could think of a few other things you might build that would be more appropriate to that particular locale. But I just had a student who's doing some interesting things. A guy named Matt Fisher. He's working with at-risk students. He started out as a STEM teacher, but he's gone out of the regular classroom into this classroom, and he's just doing a lot of interesting things with them. As far as I was just looking at, one of the things he's doing is repairing like old stand-up video consoles. But they're just, he essentially, what he has is a shop. He's like a old shop teacher, but it's all connected to STEM. So it's not what we generally think of. When I think of a STEM classroom, I think of, a 3D printer and, different types of robotics and, all of these sort of artificial, to me, to some degree, products, that we buy. And so he's just a really neat instructor who is thinking outside of the box as it relates to connecting with kids today, especially with a population of kids who are not the grade kids. Like my son, he was not a grade kid. He wouldn't read for AR. He thought reading should be for fun. It shouldn't be for a grade. And so, that's something that, like I said, kind of connected to, and I sent you a link of an article about Matt. He did his web quest at the time when I had him as a student. He was building a pool, an in-ground pool in his backyard by himself. And he made this is how long ago it was, he made his web quest about that project and actually used it for several years with his students to great effect. So that's kind of what I think about. One of the things just you guys were talking about earlier, and I don't want to take over, I hadn't talked the whole time, but it's kind of one of the things we need to do just in my environment is, and it's kind of a low level thing, but we just got to blast out of I think about one of the things I've been trying to do for several years is just get different furniture in my room that is more conducive to the type of class that I want to have. I've tried several years to write a grant for Steelcase, which makes a lot of that furniture. But we're just still in higher ed, we've still, at least in my institution and in the School of Ed, we're in an old office building. It just to a large degree, I think that could help us change the way that we are teaching. So that's one of the things I was thinking about too, just sort of a low level thing, but just creating much more of a space that is conducive to project-based learning or maker spaces, because we don't have that. So I'll say, I just didn't want you to think I was one of those people who had logged in all day and was off doing my laundry or something like that. So enjoying the conversation.
Excellent. Well, some really great points there, and I absolutely agree. A physical space in the world is so important. The idea that we can ignore space because of cyberspace, to me seems very, very dangerous. I think we can augment space with cyberspace, but replacing it seems very, very problematic. And so in terms of the physical space at UTEP, we have a maker space. Before it was a maker space, it was an ed tech lab. Before that, it had a couple of names. And some people say the makerspace is just a rebranding of shop class. And I say there's some really important key distinctions. I think the big difference between a makerspace and shop class is a physically dangerous environment where you can get cut. People lose fingers, people lose toes, people lose worse. And it's very boy-centric. It's incredibly boy-centric. A makerspace is one, none of the equipment is allowed to be dangerous. None of it is age inappropriate. When we have a 3D printer pen, it's one that you can touch, which costs a little bit more, but it's safe to touch. When we have a 3D printer, it's in a box and it has a few. So we make sure if it's not safe, we don't leave it in the room. Monty likes to make things dangerous, but I'm too risk averse. I like to make things scary, but safe. And so the other big difference between a makerspace and the old idea of a hacker space, which they say is, you know, less dangerous, less gender biased, is a hackerspace through the popular media has a very criminal tone to it. And even though computer programmers might dislike that or disagree with it, the word hacker will always be synonymous with criminal for many people who aren't ed tech professors. A makerspace is a kid-friendly, safe place where the only danger is I might not make something awesome and my friends will think that I'm lame. And that's what I strive for. We have a pre-K through 6th grade space where I can leave the room and feel like the kids will be okay for 10 minutes and the equipment will too. And so I definitely want things to be super high engagement. I love that feeling of danger, but I want it to be the kind of danger that a roller coaster presents, where the person who designed the roller coaster knows it's 100% safe, but the kids on the roller coaster feel like it's a real journey and that their lives are at risk, you know, metaphorically. So who wants to build on that? I think we have 8 minutes left.
So Daniel, one thing I just want to jump in, because I think, Cecil, you said something, it was further up in the thing, but it had to do with student agency. And that has been something I have been interested in for a while. It's a foundational piece of the way some people conceptualize maker-centered learning. Like so foundational, like it could be almost considered the thing that separates maker-centered learning from problem-based learning is this degree, and that was Pappert's word, right? The idea of giving them some agency, they do something they care about. And so we've been working really hard trying to figure that out, and it's really difficult. I found it's amazingly difficult to have a K-12 classroom, and I've been working with teachers to try to design these experiences of you come up with an assignment that does do, you know, teaches something, but all the kids get some choice. And I've seen people do varying degrees of it, but I guess I'd just like to throw that out to the group. If anyone has any ideas of ways to bring in student agency to K-12 classrooms that work, I'd love to hear that.
Hey, Monty, I'm thinking a lot about that agency piece that you were talking about, and this isn't necessarily for K-12 classrooms, but it's for my K-12 pre-service teachers. And we've talked a little bit about the assignments that I do, and I think one of the issues is that my students are always like, yes, I want to have agency and I'm there, I'm ready to do it, but when it comes down to it, I have to get a letter grade. So here I have agency and I'm excited about these things, but what do you want to see? What do you want to look at as a professor from my performance? And you know, that assignment that I talked about, the emerging technology creation assignment, that I have them just create something in our makerspace or in any of the tools that we've used. I get so many questions, but I purposefully wrote the rubric that says, you created something, even if it failed. So did it fail? Tell us what happened. Tell me the process. I don't care about the actual tool, if you're going to use it or not. And so, you know, I think letting them have that agency and have that success and failure within agency allows them to, and I think it's the same for K-12, it allows them to get more used to the idea of I have control over my own learning.
Yeah, great points, Jason. And to give my answer to Monty, to build on that, I can give you the exact opposite of what you want, which is a Foxconn factory. A Foxconn factory hits every metric on the rubric. They're producing iPhones, the greatest product ever. They've got children producing iPhones. If I could get a group of 3rd graders building iPhones for a PBL project, I'd be a genius. But Foxconn has the highest suicide rate in the world of any factory, right? Because they have no agency, right? So you've got children producing iPhones. In theory, PBL should be going crazy, but they recognize this is the opposite of PBL. This is like what drives people to like despair over life. And so like, what's the opposite of working at Foxconn? but keeping the same, like, we're making something awesome and it's great, but we have agency is to me kind of one way to frame it. What do you think, Cecil? What's your idea?
So, I mean, this is an area that I'm really interested in because I look a lot at blended teaching, which is, the strategic combination of that online space with that physical space. And I think one of the benefits that we can get from using the online space as part of that physical space is it allows more personalization for students. It does allow them to have more control over the goals of their learning, the time, the pace, the place, the path that they take to meet those goals. And so going back to what Jason said, like if your goal for learning is I want to learn to create a guitar and you create a guitar that doesn't work, you still learn something, like you still progress towards that goal. And so I think we really have to rethink, when we give students that choice, how are we helping them to meet their goals, and how are we really measuring their successes, and how are we supporting their failures, not just saying, because I think that's one of the problems that we have with a lot of traditional assessments is like, well, you failed, you can try again. But in this, we can say, hey, you failed. What did you learn from that? I think we too often lose reflection as part of the learning process. You get that grade on the assessment, we're moving on, we're done learning with that stuff. And it's like, no, that grade should do something, that evaluation, that feedback should do something for the student. And I think that's just a responsibility that as teachers, we have to take control of. We have to be able to say, yeah, I am giving you this freedom, but this is how I'm helping you. And to go to what Jason said about like students, they want that choice, but then they want to know what your expectations are, right? Like they're a little guarded. And I think we see this all the time, like with consumers, like we want an illusion of choice. Like I want to walk into Subway and have 6 types of bread. I don't need to know all the hundreds of combinations of sandwiches they can make. I need to have the illusion of getting choice. I want to walk into Chipotle and have the illusion of like a burrito or a bowl and all these different combinations, when really I'm just making a series of 4 choices over and over again. And so I think knowing how to create an environment that's conducive to that is really important if we want to foster some of these soft skills that we think are important for students.
Definitely. I see David Rutledge is commenting. David Rutledge, could you speak with us live?
Yeah, just a second. This is just one of my favorite books. I don't know if any of you ever read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but it basically really just summarizes this whole conversation, right? Up a failure to teach. If grades are removed, the class is forced to wonder each day what is really learning, right? What's being taught? What's the goal? How do assignments accomplish this goal? Like, as you've been talking, Daniel, and there's all these other side conversations coming in, I'm like, why does this sound so familiar? And so I went straight, the internet, looked up that quote, and I found it. And removal of grades exposes a huge and frightening vacuum. That's a role. If you take away grades, what are we as instructors doing? Right? And what are the students doing? Like we don't know where to go without some way to evaluate ourselves. But I think the conversation is the difference between assessment, evaluation, and grading. Just like schooling, education, and learning are all different things, right? We don't want to confound schooling with learning, right? And education with learning. They happen at different places and different times. So yeah, that's one of my favorite quotes from the book. And thanks for reminding me, Daniel. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's one of those books I must confess to not fully understanding it. Maybe I'll try it again now that I'm older.
You got to get through the first 100 pages.
I finished it, but I didn't understand it very much. I didn't understand the popularity, but I was glad I tried it. So it
was from the 60s. They were smoking a lot of weed and doing a lot of stuff. But
yeah, I think you had to like experience that time to understand what it was about. Okay. So. Excellent. Well, I think we're officially out of time. I just want to thank everyone for joining us. I see as a final comment, Christy says they're building a Foxconn factory in Wisconsin. Is that true? No.
Yeah, a really big one.
Oh,
like an hour north of Chicago, hour south of Milwaukee.
Wow. All right. So, well, everyone, stay healthy.